Hello and welcome to Reimagining Cyber. My name is Tyler Moffitt, and I'm a senior security analyst at OpenText. This week, our guest is Tim Armandpour from PagerDuty. PagerDuty is a SaaS company that offers its incident management and operations platform via the cloud, and they are big players in the space with over 30,000 customers worldwide, and that includes names like Vanguard, Zoom, and NVIDIA. Tim is PagerDuty's CTO and a technology executive with broad experience in product development, business operations, and building growing stellar teams. Hello, Tim, and thank you for joining us on Reimagining Cyber. Is there anything else you would like to share on your background?
No, hi, Tyler. Thanks for having me. I think the way you portrayed me, my mom will be very proud, so I'm all good.
And I guess we're just going to jump right in and talk about, cyber risk posture specifically. How does an organization determine its acceptable level of cyber risk? And why is this decision crucial for its overall, security strategy?
It really starts with assessing and establishing what's the highest level of risk or risk tolerance that the company's willing to accept to run as, right? You talk about and think about what's acceptable, both even like not just from a business standpoint, but even culturally, internally, right? Depending on
Mm,
experience, skill sets, and also like the types of objectives and where you play as a company comes in. You tend to want to approach from with a balanced slate that has everything from general productivity and team-based velocity that comes into account, but then also being very true and real to what are the most important types of family of controls and policies and implementation that's required to help the company effectively like continuously manage risk appropriately and ultimately cyber. And you know this notion of like risk appetite, it's really, I think, been brought to the forefront more and more in terms of how you identify this, but then how do you actually go around and evaluate risk end to end. And I think your cyber resiliency posture, I think, has really, really not just been so isolated, but now it's starting to show up more and more in the context of the business and not just for almost like hygiene and vanity's sake at the end of the day.
how often should organizations assess their risk posture or appetite, especially with, rapidly evolving technologies like AI?
I think, ultimately you strive for this notion of like a almost like sentience, right? Like where it's like continuous. It's a certain way of being where, you have the right kind of foundations in both, it's like the classic triangle of a, you know, process, people, and tools. In terms of the risk appetite, it's like, all right, what assets require what kind of level of defense or protection? How much do you invest in controls such that it's not cost prohibitive? I think that's one of the more interesting things where a lot of us end up spending time because there's so much compliance that gets thrown at companies these days. It's quite untenable. So then you try and bring in a bit of pragmatism in play where it's like the old adage, just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure, right? So you kind of need both running in some kind of a symbiotic relationship, but also be able to pressure test each other on both sides of it, right? And that's where you get in the game of understanding what's business critical, what shows up in terms of really like just hard no nonsense regulatory requirements if you choose to play in certain, whether it's geography or industries, right? And then where are your customer expectations at, because those are some of the things that may not exactly be written but just need to be understood and accepted as well. And then you try and approach with a set of frameworks that can operationalize this across the company. But the traditional sense is, well, you run your annual audits, and there's third party audits, there's your own internal audits that are running in order to test your compliance stature. Most customers would probably say, well, that's really interesting and good, but probably insufficient, because we want assurance that you're continuously up to speed on how well and how tight you're able to operate and be able to govern things across the board for your business. It's similar to like, we don't measure our availability of the platform to the business on an annual basis. It's continuous, it's in real time.
That seems probably pretty tough. Most people probably see that as like a regular evaluation, not a continual thing.
I was going to say, I think part is like how you actually start to establish some of those cultural norms, like what is important to the organizations, right? So, a lot of stuff that's been happening over the last decade plus in industry around the ambition to continue to shift left part of your security practices, where the notion of like, security and let's say software and systems development are more or less part of the same sentence, right? So how do you create enablement, knowledge, skills, and actually find leverage points via tooling and some smart technology choices, investments, and implementation to make it feel like those gates, if you will, are there, but they're fairly invisible. It's kind of like getting on roads in some parts of the country where there's toll roads and toll gates, and you're looking for loose change, or you have the fast track modules that are there. They're monitoring you, they're seeing you, and they're charging you, but it's fairly pervasive and invisible to you as the driver. You're not getting interrupted.
Trying to keep it continuous and trying to keep it invisible, like you said, how do you ensure sort of trust in the security for your customers, particularly when it comes to like managing the data and operational resilience?
I think these considerations that come into play for a SaaS player, right? And protection, data management is arguably like one of those central pillars of investments, and there's multiple ways to approach protecting, and everything from how's traffic encrypted, how's data encrypted and managed, whether in transit or at rest. Data segregation goes a long way. So we're SaaS, we're in the public cloud, multi-tenant SaaS. So what this means is that we've got common physical and logical infrastructure that manages data across the 30,000 plus customers that we have with logical separation. So in order to ensure that one customer's data never cross talks or becomes part of another customer's data set, goes into like how you view data architecture, your systems architecture from the ground up to have some strict boundaries, have some familiar patterns in play that enforces that aspect of segregation. And then you get into the fun world of the layering of what does access and authentication authorization start to look like inside your architecture. We've been prominent, and I think one of the early believers in zero trust and how important that is.
That's a big term.
It's a big term. In fact, when I've been here at PagerDuty for 10 years, when we were a little bit smaller, a little bit sillier, but I remember many people joining and asking about how do I get on the VPN? We would tell them we don't have a VPN. Oh, what do you mean? It's like,
Mhm.
well, because we actually don't trust you. So every time you are not only authenticating, but trying to authorize for access to certain things, we're going to interrogate and inspect every packet, every request along the way. And we've established that both, internally within our enterprise, but then also in our cloud-based environments, whether it's especially when you think of the east-west traffic patterns, right? So when services and systems have to actually talk to each other, there is no understanding that anything is where it should be. And so, I think the zero trust architecture and the principles that you abide by there, they definitely form as like powerful foundations to drive off of, especially when it comes to, authorization at every layer, every step of the way.
You did a good job there. I mean, when we talk about zero trust, I always felt like it was sort of a buzzword, sort of a utopia, unattainable unicorn, if that makes sense. But you seem to dissect that pretty well to try and define it, if that makes sense. Most people have struggled. Shifting gears here, I guess, talking about SDLC. How did the CrowdStrike incident that everybody remembers last year, all these airports taken offline, everybody, it was like nightmare day for everybody. Everybody, I know in IT pinging me about it. How did that CrowdStrike incident impact PagerDuty's approach to the software development lifecycle and security practices?
What last July 24 taught us and almost like reminded a lot of us in the industry about is, this notion of like, your resiliency posture. It's not just about software and systems and things with blinking lights that continue to be blinking, right? It actually brought to the forefront of your total resiliency posture, that where you've got software and system resiliency, you've got your internal process in terms of resiliency, and then also your cyber resiliency. And here we are with what transpired is, you got a software defect that ended up, having a pretty strong ripple effect across all kinds of industries, right? From an uptime and availability perspective, availability to serve their own customers perspective. We've definitely been, I think, in the business of always looking at ways where we can continue to improve our resiliency posture for the benefit of our customers. In fact, one of those things you start to really think through is like, okay, well, how do we define resiliency? What are those important characteristics about resiliency? And I think what sits at the forefront for us and a lot of the colleagues I've interacted with over the last year is, your things are going to fail. Your things are always in some kind of state of failure. That's just the way complex systems work. and your effectiveness of how fast and well and effective you can actually recover from said failure mode is really start to kind of demonstrate what your resiliency posture is. And that's everything from, again, process, tooling, information, policy. There's a lot of different things that can come into play. One thing that we definitely remind ourselves that to take a closer look around when it comes to certain types of configuration changes. How well do we actually sandbox those? Then how well do we control the rollout on that front? Given the type of change and how it's propagated out into the wild from last July, unfortunately there's a whole lot of control that, customers and partners had in the grand scheme of things. But also it's a matter of like when that type of scenario happens and it's like this severity zero, all hands on deck kind of thing. How well practiced are you to respond and effectively, identify, isolate, mitigate, remediate? And that's where, again, I think as an industry, we found that many types of companies, whether they've been around for 50 plus years or been around for 5 years, the notion of, operational resiliency and just operations in general is really, really brittle. And there's a lot of room for improvement. So, we've taken a closer look around, again, configuration changes. We've been very good in general around software changes that go out into our environments, both internally within, let's say, our endpoints within the enterprise, like workstations, laptops, etc. But then also our cloud-based, compute environments. We've been fairly good around being able to control the rollouts there. But again, just another healthy reminder that, supply chain management, how well versed are you on your supply chain dependencies and how they work? And again, you can only bootstrap so much at the end of the day because you're in a way
Yeah.
you're trusting that provider to do, hold up their end of the bargain, do their part of the job. And it's going to be slightly imperfect. So as you think about your supply chain ecosystem, what are the failure modes that come into play that again go back to like, what's most important to the business? And then how well do you understand those types of failure modes such that you have like mitigating procedures, mitigating capabilities to be able to offset and minimize, the customer business impact overall. Not easy.
It comes back to like we were talking about earlier with the resilience and posture and the mindset and the culture, because you're completely right that that dwell time between like the bounce back between the remediation from issue, it is, I feel like that length of time is what sets you apart from the pack of absolute catastrophic crisis comms terrible and okay, it was just a bad day or day plus.
No, absolutely. What was really interesting to see from our perspective is, we didn't have a material impact, which was great to see. Whereas we had with the type of customer footprint we have, we had basically what we call like this event storm that shows up. So we sustained nearly 250% above normal levels of incoming traffic to us and still stayed up, still did our job, which was to be there for our customers at the end of the day when they're having a bit of a bad moment. But just seeing a bit of the internet start to go sideways was really interesting. And then we were able to see, what types of industries seem to recover better than others.
What did you find?
It's kind of like how you saw with where consumers and customers and end users were most impacted. Travel and hospitality was hit very hard. It's funny, I remember picking up my son from from a crew rowing camp over at Stanford, driving to San Jose Airport the day this was happening, that Friday. And you walk into San Jose Airport, and what was even more interesting is dumb lucky, we were flying Southwest Airlines.
Oh,
I don't think for all we know is what, yeah, run out of Commodore 64 at that point in time.
oh, the one running on an 84.
But either way, they were the only airline that had their status screens up. The only thing in the airport that seemed to be not having a blue screen come up, and it was just one of those interesting moments where it's like, okay, we got dumb lucky, right? But travel and hospitality overall. But again, it still starts to reinforce this notion of like operational resilience and cyber being a very big part of it. But overall operational resilience is not just like the tech ops or operations or engineering or security problem space to be focused on. It's actually sitting at the CEO and the board agenda now because it's that important to the business. And we see it manifest when, what kind of damage like certain types of disruption can cause.
Absolutely. And that's good to see it move to the boards now. I mean, you would assume so, that it would maybe already be there, and maybe for many organizations it wasn't. And so now these things are becoming more important and they're shifting it, which is good to see.
Exactly.
So agentic AI, that's definitely something we want to talk about. What are the key security challenges posed by agentic AI, and why must organizations be cautious when integrating these systems into their operations?
What gets really interesting with what's emerged so quickly is the notion that it's not new for applied AI to be sitting inside systems where certain types of things can be managed almost autonomously, right? That is part of the nature of like the reasoning capability of AI as we've known it to date. Now we've seen this explosion effect where the this shift from like even like from like a security landscape perspective, there's like this fundamental shift, and we can't really readily define it yet, it feels like, because there are like there's like stuff that sits in the theoretical bucket, right? Like the what could become kind of scenario. And then there's things that are really showing up in like the more like the practical real world in terms of security challenges. And I think the pieces around like you think about like the expansion of like, attack surface, for example, right? And where in prior, let's say to the last, I don't know, call it 18 months or so, we'd be
Hmm.
very comfortable sitting and going through an identified set of types of, let's say from a systems perspective, you identify the types of risk vectors, you start to threat model those types of things as proactively as you can, and then you start to document. Now you start to build in, certain kinds of boundaries or control scenarios and or influence implementation patterns within your software and your systems environment to be able to offset those threat models. Well, now you've got these agents that are really just like mini applications that are running in your environment, right? And these agents are actually designed to almost push on the boundaries and push on this notion of so access can't actually be predefined because that's going to limit what the agent can do. And depending on your appetite for what the agent needs to do, or now the set of agents that may represent, each agent might represent, a set of like discrete tasks in the past. Well, now you have a range of tasks. And now you have the dynamic nature of being able to actually, the expectation is that, these individual agents can independently initiate certain types of actions or things across now multiple areas of your system. And that's just in your own environment, let alone the notion of your first party agents being able to coexist and talk to third party agents. And then you start to think about what type of authorization schemes have to be in play to actually enforce and allow and actually monitor and audit whether or not an agent is actually authorized to do a certain set of things. And yet again, you go back to like the bit of a paradox situation around the traditional models of being able to, authenticate a thing, and now I'm comfortable to be able to authorize it. But you can't just do that once anymore with the agents. Again, it has to be like this continuous notion, like continuous authentication, continuous authorization, continuous interrogation, continuous audit and monitoring that I think really pushes on, existing models that are in play, which then, things that we've talked about internally here around how much more credence and or investment we all need to do around like, intent-based patterns and solutions out there where, we've had that in the systems for a while. You can programatize and really leverage some powerful platforms out there, but now that has to almost become part of your norm versus the notion of predefine all the policies, predefine all the next stages of tasks and actions that are allowed. Again, it's like flipping a lot of things on top of its head. And I think organizations need to really like almost like it's like the Men in Black episode where they zap you and say, forget what you knew before. It's almost like how we have to approach this in a way that opens up our eyes a little bit so we don't have so much bias or
Mm.
even unconscious bias built into our strategies, and really take a much broader look and try and again, with things moving so fast, it's super hard, but trying to understand like, okay, in 6, 12, 18, 24 months, where's that puck going to be? And where in terms of from my resilience posture and or practices and technology choices, how well can I position myself to continue to adapt and be ready for the next thing? And that's, I think, not necessarily new when you think of like how AIs influence parts of, cyber resilience posture. But what is new, again, these agents, they're for them to be as powerful as we believe they're going to be, they're going to be, more or less acting on their own. And how are we going to ensure that they can do it safely and responsibly?
That's scary for sure. Definitely, think about Skynet and you're talking about how
Yeah.
intent-based access, wild for sure. Here's one thing that I wanted to ask and talk to you about: critical incidents with large enterprises. So, without naming names, can you share an example of a moments where even like a large, sophisticated organization like just massively dropped the ball during a major incident, like situations where you'd expect them to like have it together, but the basics were missing? I think it would be reassuring for our listeners to know that even big players struggle with the fundamentals.
It's a good question. There are certain patterns that I think we all struggle with, right? And whether you're big or small, established, up and coming in terms of a company or brand or new product offering. One thing that I think shows up quite often, it's not necessarily from a technology driven perspective. And again, this is the thing that I think doesn't get talked about enough in the universe we all choose to live in, but it's around the not just the capabilities of the people and the organizations involved, but also the proficiency that exists. And the challenge with proficiency, where things really break down, is you might have like written playbooks where if I see a certain thing on a graph dip a certain way, now go do X, Y, Z. And if that's pretty well understood, you can start to automate that. And that creates a bit of, leverage and you get more throughput at lower cost. Everybody wins, right? The challenge comes in where when you get out of like the very well understood stuff, right, to the things that are only maybe kind of like partially understood, or even the new and novel, right? And this is where, when the clock is ticking, something's really burning. How well practiced are you? How often do you practice, reacting to a failure mode? It could be a failure mode of any kind. And I do think I find many organizations that are very candidly completely out of practice. How that manifests is even some of those well understood issues just take too long to identify, to diagnose, and to ultimately, mitigate. They just take too long. Why? Because, well, this other new set of team members are now in the mix and they didn't know and they hadn't really done something like this. And I do think it gets into like a bit of I don't mean to go on a philosophical sandbox rant here, but I think in the industry across technologists at large, we often don't give enough credence to the experience and skills that are required to effectively, troubleshoot and debug. And that type of practice actually shows up so much more across when you think about like what does technical contribution look like for an individual contributor. You actually end up, again, if you're in the business of, you build it, you code it, you own it type of philosophy, which I've been a long-standing proponent of that. And we indoctrinate that here at PagerDuty. You end up spending quite a bit more time in debugging, troubleshooting, understanding how your part or your pieces work in the entirety, the complexity profile of your system, than writing code. And in fact, if you're really doing things pretty darn well, you think about technical contribution at large, banging on the keyboard really fast is not really about writing code. It's actually about how effective are you designing up front and taking account for all those different types of scenarios and things like that, to design for failure, to practice what does reacting to failure look like and feel like. And I think those types of foundational capabilities have a material set of inputs and ultimate impact on your actual resiliency posture at large. And we just don't talk about or preach about it enough. So there's a lot of talk, again, rightfully so, around, the agents. But the humans leading the charge is still a thing. I don't see that readily going away. And how we have like this continuous learning and development mindset around, reacting to a thing really starts to, change the game and almost like raise the bar materially for an organization. And ultimately, your teams benefit because now they're more prone and more proficient in operating this way. But then also, your customers all benefit. And you know, that's what we're all in the business of.
Yeah, doing dry runs and rehearsals for like hypothetical scenarios that you just imagine that could potentially happen. I could see that really being a benefit. While, it may not actually ever happen, just the ability to sort of wing it and know what you would be able to handle, or what your process you could do in those scenarios is, I think, These are a lot of good lessons there and what you had. Thank you for answering that. Is there any finishing or closing thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
One final thought is as we think about again, like the notion of, risk management at large, resiliency posture, finding ways, I think as us as like technologists, finding ways where we can do it in the most effective and practical way so it does not inhibit the business is still like this, there's no real playbook for that. And I think as long as we're all comfortable in knowing that we are striving to be able to do the right things and right by the business, then we give ourselves a fighting chance, which is, I think, what we want our organizations to be able to believe.
That's great stuff. You have a wealth of knowledge, Tim. I won't lie. I've learned a lot here on this podcast. Yeah, could pick your brain for hours.
Oh, I appreciate that, Tyler. I could talk all day long. It's super fun.
Well, thank you for joining the Reimagining Cyber podcast. It was great to have you on, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Super fun.
Hello, producer Ben here, and just a quick message before we bring the episode to an end. A big thank you to you, the listener, for helping us make it into the best 100 cybersecurity podcast rankings, as compiled by Million Podcasts. We couldn't have done it without you. And to help us stay there, remember to follow or subscribe to the show and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.